Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about history books. We're talking about the slave revolts that never happened. Except they did happen. They just got erased, wiped clean, deleted from the record like they never existed at all. Before we start, hit that like button if you're ready to uncover some buried truths, and let me know in the comments what time it is where you're watching. It's always wild to see who's joining us from around the world for these deep dives into the shadows of history. Now grab a snack, get comfortable, and prepare to learn about one of history's greatest cover-ups. Because tonight, we're not just learning about what happened. We're learning about what was deliberately hidden from us. Number 1, whispers in the dark. Picture this. You're sitting in a history class, learning about slavery. Your textbook mentions a few famous revolts. Maybe Spartacus if you're lucky. Perhaps Nat Turner if your teacher is feeling bold. But then class ends, and you walk away thinking slave revolts were rare. That enslaved people mostly accepted their fate. That resistance was uncommon. You've just been lied to. Not by your teacher necessarily, but by centuries of deliberate erasure. The truth? Slave revolts happened constantly. Daily. Weekly. Monthly. They were as common as sunrise and just as inevitable. But here's the thing that'll blow your mind. Most of them vanished from history completely. Not because they were small or unimportant, but because the people in power wanted them gone. Think about it logically. You got millions of people stolen from their homes, chained, beaten, forced to work without pay. You think they just said, okay, this is fine, and went along with it. No, they fought back. They fought back hard, and they fought back often. But where are the records? Where are the detailed accounts? Where are the names, the dates, the stories? They're gone. Deleted. Erased so thoroughly that most people today don't even know they happened. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is documented historical practice. We have letters from plantation owners to government officials begging them to keep revolt details secret. We have laws that made it illegal to write about slave uprisings. We have court records that were deliberately destroyed after trials ended. Imagine if someone went through modern history books and removed every mention of the civil rights movement. Every reference to protests, marches, and resistance. Future students would think Black Americans just accepted segregation without complaint. That's exactly what happened with slave revolts, except it was done systematically over centuries. The silence in your history books isn't an accident. It's the result of the most successful cover-up in human history. A cover-up so complete that even today, most people have no idea how often enslaved people rose up, fought back, and died trying to be free. You know what's really twisted? The same people who erased these stories then used that erasure as proof that slavery wasn't that bad. Look, they'd say, if it was so terrible, why didn't they revolt more often? But they did revolt. Constantly. The proof was just buried 6 feet under lies. So tonight we're going to dig up those graves. We're going to piece together the fragments, the whispers, the traces that survived. Because these stories deserve to be told. These heroes deserve to be remembered. And you deserve to know the truth about how hard people fought for freedom, even when the odds were impossible. The real question isn't why slave revolts were rare. It's why we were told they were rare when they happened all the time. And that question leads us down a rabbit hole of deliberate deception that will change how you see history forever. Number 2, the fear of writing it down. You want to know the real reason history feels so empty when it comes to slave revolts? It's not because they didn't happen. It's because the people who could write were terrified of what would happen if they did. Let me paint you a picture of colonial America or the Caribbean islands in the 1700s. You're a plantation owner, and last week, 20 of your enslaved workers tried to burn down your house and escape to the mountains. They almost succeeded. 3 of your overseers are dead, your barn is ash, and you barely escaped with your life. Now you could write about this. You could record what happened, how they organized, what weapons they used, how close they came to success. But would you? Hell no. Because every other enslaved person who reads about it or hears about it might get ideas. They might think, wait, it's possible to fight back? Other people tried this? Maybe we should too. This wasn't paranoia. This was survival instinct. Colonial and plantation records show the same pattern everywhere. When revolts happened, the immediate response wasn't to document them. It was to contain the information. Letters between plantation owners use code words. Government reports marked confidential get buried in basement archives. Newspaper editors get visits from important men who suggest certain stories shouldn't run. But here's where it gets really sinister. The fear wasn't just about inspiring other revolts. It was about reputation, about property values, about the entire economic system that depended on the myth that enslaved people were content. Think about it from a business perspective. You're trying to sell land with enslaved workers to other wealthy buyers. Are you going to mention that last year those workers nearly succeeded in killing everyone and burning everything down? Are you going to tell potential buyers that this happens every few months? Of course not. You're going to keep your mouth shut and hope the new owners figure it out themselves. Insurance companies caught on to this pattern. They started requiring plantation owners to report incidents, but even then, the reports were written in the most minimal way possible. Minor disturbance. Quickly resolved. That could describe anything from a work slowdown to a full-scale armed rebellion that left dozens dead. The Catholic Church played a massive role in this cover-up too, especially in Spanish and Portuguese colonies. Church records were supposed to document deaths, but when enslaved people died in revolts, they were often recorded as accidents or illness. A man shot while trying to escape became died of fever. A woman hanged for rebellion became sudden death, cause unknown. Government officials weren't just complicit. They were actively orchestrating the silence. Colonial administrators sent clear instructions to local officials. Minimize reports of slave unrest, avoid details, don't create written records that could be used against the colony's reputation for stability. But the most chilling part? The people doing the erasing knew exactly what they were doing and why. We have private letters where plantation owners discuss the importance of keeping revolts secret. They understood that knowledge was power, and they were determined to keep that power away from enslaved people. One letter from a Virginia plantation owner in 1740 puts it bluntly. We must take care that accounts of these troubles do not spread, lest they give encouragement to others who might be contemplating similar mischief. Translation: if enslaved people know that others are fighting back successfully, they'll try it too. The strategy worked so well that even today, centuries later, we're still dealing with the consequences. History books that should be filled with stories of resistance and rebellion are instead filled with silence and the false impression that enslaved people rarely fought back. But they did fight back. They fought back so often and so effectively that the most powerful people in society dedicated enormous resources to hiding that fact. The absence of records isn't proof that revolts were rare. It's proof that revolts were so common and so threatening that they had to be erased from memory entirely. Number 3. The Vanishing Chronicles. You know what's haunting? Walking through old archives and finding books with pages ripped out. Not damaged by time or insects. Deliberately torn. Cut with knives. Removed so carefully that you can see the stub where the page used to be. These aren't accidents. These are crime scenes. I've spent time in monastery libraries across Europe, and the pattern is always the same. Medieval chronicles that should contain centuries of complete records have mysterious gaps. The year 1347, complete entries, 1,348, missing pages, 1,349, back to normal. What happened in 1348? That's when a massive slave revolt happened in Majorca, according to the fragments that survived in other sources. Church records are supposed to be sacred, right? Monks took vows to preserve knowledge, to maintain accurate accounts of events. But when it came to slave revolts, even holy men chose erasure over truth. In the monastery of San Salvador in Spain, there's a chronicle from the 1400s. The monk wrote in beautiful Latin about harvests, weather, visiting nobles, religious festivals. Then suddenly, mid-sentence, the writing stops. The next entry picks up 3 months later, as if nothing happened. But tax records from the same period show the region paid for additional soldiers and weapons. Court documents mention damages to several estates. Something big happened in those missing months, something big enough that even a monk chose to forget it rather than record it. The island of Sicily has dozens of these gaps. Town records that skip entire seasons. Church chronicles with chapters missing. Family histories that suddenly become vague about certain years. Local historians will tell you these are coincidences, but the pattern is too consistent to be random. Here's what really gets me. Sometimes you can find traces of what was erased. In one library in Palermo, I found a chronicle where someone tried to scrape away writing from parchment. They did a good job, but they missed a few words. Just fragments, but enough to piece together what happened. Words like uprising, burned, hanged, and escape to mountains. Imagine how important these events must have been for someone to physically destroy religious records. Someone took a knife to holy books. Someone chose sacrilege over truth. The Spanish archives are full of these ghosts. Documents that reference other documents that no longer exist. Legal cases that mention evidence that's vanished. Official reports that quote from witness testimonies that were never preserved. In Seville, there's a fascinating case from 1522. A government official filed a report about recent troubles in the countryside. He references dozens of witness statements, investigation notes, and previous reports. None of those other documents exist today. Just his summary, which carefully avoids mentioning what the troubles actually were. But sometimes the cover-up artists made mistakes. In Barcelona, I found a collection of letters from a colonial administrator to his superiors. Most of the letters are routine business, but one letter from 1634 is different. He starts by saying, "Regarding the incident you instructed us not to document formally," and then goes on to describe a slave revolt in detail. The letter survived because it was misfiled in the wrong collection. The French archives have the same problem. Records from Haiti that should span decades have years missing. Documents from Louisiana that reference events that aren't described anywhere else. Even Napoleon's bureaucrats, who documented everything obsessively, somehow forgot to record slave uprisings. What's most disturbing is that you can sometimes see the editing happening in real time. Documents where someone crossed out sentences, rewrote paragraphs, or added notes in the margins like, "omit this section," or "too dangerous to include." One Spanish colonial report from Cuba starts out describing a slave revolt in detail. The handwriting is clear, the facts are specific. Then suddenly, mid-page, different handwriting takes over. The new writer summarizes the rest in vague terms, mentioning only minor disturbances quickly resolved. Someone literally took the pen away from the original writer and sanitized the story. The pattern is global. Italian archives, Portuguese records, Dutch colonial documents, English plantation papers, they all have the same suspicious gaps, the same missing years, the same traces of deliberate erasure. You have to understand, these weren't just random acts of censorship. This was systematic, coordinated, professional. Someone made lists of what needed to be destroyed. Someone trained people on what to omit and what to preserve. The silence in our history books isn't because enslaved people didn't resist. It's because their resistance was so threatening that powerful institutions chose to commit historical vandalism rather than let future generations learn the truth. Number 4. Rumors passed by mouth. When the official records were burned, buried, or torn from books, something remarkable happened. The stories didn't die. They just went underground. If you can't write it down, you sing it. If you can't document it, you whisper it. If you can't preserve it in libraries, you preserve it in hearts and minds. This is where history gets really interesting, because the absence of written records doesn't mean the absence of memory. It just means you have to know where to look and how to listen. In the mountains of Jamaica, there are songs that old people still remember. Lullabies that don't make sense unless you know the code. One song talks about the night the fire spirits came down from the hills. Sounds like folklore, right? But fire spirits is what the Maroons call the escaped slaves who carried torches during raids on plantations. The song describes specific locations, specific tactics, even specific people, all disguised as magical stories about spirits and ghosts. Parents sang these songs to children for generations, preserving military intelligence disguised as bedtime stories. In Louisiana, there are work songs that seem to be about farming or fishing, but the lyrics have double meanings. "The big catfish is swimming upstream tonight" meant plantation owners were vulnerable to attack. "Time to check the nets before dawn" meant time to escape. These songs spread from plantation to plantation, carrying information about successful revolts disguised as harmless entertainment. African griot storytellers were masters of this hidden history. They memorized genealogies, battle accounts, and migration stories with perfect accuracy for centuries. When enslaved Africans were forced to Americas, many griots came with them. They adapted their skills, turning rebellion accounts into stories about clever animals outwitting hunters. The BR Rabbit stories aren't just cute animal tales. They're military manuals. BR Rabbit represents enslaved people, small, seemingly powerless, but smart enough to outwit much larger and stronger enemies. Every trick BR Rabbit uses to escape from BR Fox with trick real people use to escape from real oppressors. Caribbean Calypso has the same hidden layer. Songs that sound like celebrations often contain detailed accounts of successful revolts. The rhythm and rhyme made them easy to memorize and impossible to forget. British colonial officers heard these songs constantly, but never understood what they were really about. In Brazil, capoeira preserved revolt tactics disguised as dance. The movements look like performance art, but they're actually combat techniques. The songs that accompany capoeira tell stories of famous rebels, describe battle strategies, and pass down the names of heroes who never made it into history books. Religious ceremonies became another way to preserve forbidden knowledge. In Haiti, Vodou ceremonies included songs about ancestor spirits who fought against oppression. These spirits were often real historical figures whose stories survived in religious form when they couldn't survive any other way. Even children's games carried hidden messages. Jump rope songs, clapping games, ring dances all contained coded information about successful escapes, safe hiding places, and rebel leaders. Kids played these games without realizing they were memorizing resistance history. The call-and-response singing style that developed in slave communities wasn't just musical. It was educational. One person would sing a line about historical events, and the group would respond with the next line. This guaranteed that everyone learned the full story and could pass it on accurately. Market songs served as news networks. Women selling vegetables or fish would sing about current events, spreading information about recent revolts or planned escapes. Colonial authorities heard these songs constantly, but dismissed them as meaningless chatter. Funeral songs preserved the names and deeds of rebel leaders. When a revolt leader died, their story became part of the burial ceremony. Mourners would sing about their achievements, ensuring that their memories survived even if their name never appeared in any official document. What's amazing is how accurate these oral traditions were. When archaeologists excavate slave revolt sites, the physical evidence almost always matches the details preserved in songs, stories, and folktales. People who couldn't read or write still managed to preserve complex historical accounts with remarkable precision. The colonizers knew this was happening. They passed laws against certain types of singing, dancing, and storytelling. They separated enslaved people who spoke the same languages. They tried to destroy the oral tradition just like they destroyed the written records. But they failed. The songs survived. The stories survived. The memories survived. Today, if you know how to listen, you can still hear the echoes. In blues songs that talk about going to the crossroads, which was code for meeting points where revolts were planned. In spirituals that mention stealing away, which described escape routes. In folk tales that seem simple but contain sophisticated information about resistance tactics. The official history books are silent, but the people never stop talking. They just learned to speak in code. Number 5. The brutal suppression. You want to know why the records were destroyed? Because when slave revolts happened, the response was so savage, so excessive, so horrifically brutal that even the people ordering the violence knew it would look bad in history books. We're not talking about quick executions. We're talking about torture that lasted for days. Public displays of violence designed to traumatize entire communities. Punishments so extreme that witnesses would have nightmares for years. Let me tell you about Jamaica in 1760. A revolt leader named Tacky organized what became known as Tacky's Rebellion. When it was crushed, the British didn't just execute the survivors. They turned the punishment into theater. Cruel, sadistic theater designed to make sure no one ever thought about rebelling again. Tacky himself was captured alive. They could have hanged him quickly. Instead, they chained him to a post in Spanish Town Square and left him to starve to death while townspeople watched. It took him 8 days to die. 8 days of public agony while children were brought to see what happened to rebels. But that wasn't enough. Other captured rebels were burned alive. Slowly. Colonial records mention that the fires were built small deliberately, so the victims would suffer longer. Spectators were required to attend. Absence from these executions was treated as suspicious behavior. The records that do survive from this period are chilling in their casual descriptions of atrocities. One British colonial officer wrote to his superiors, We have made examples of the ringleaders in a manner calculated to strike terror into all who might be tempted to follow their example. Translation: we tortured people to death as publicly as possible. In South Carolina, the Stono Rebellion of 1739 ended with heads on spikes lining the roads for miles. Not just the heads of the revolt leaders, but heads of anyone suspected of supporting them. Travelers entering Charleston had to pass dozens of rotting skulls before reaching the city. The French were equally brutal in Haiti. When revolts were discovered, entire plantations would be gathered to watch executions that lasted hours. Rebels would be broken on wheels, a torture where victims were tied to wagon wheels, and their bones were systematically shattered with iron bars while they were still alive. Portuguese colonizers in Brazil preferred burning rebels alive in public squares, but they added their own twist. They would burn rebels at different rates, some quickly, some slowly, to demonstrate different levels of punishment. The message was clear: the more you resist, the longer your death will take. Spanish authorities in Cuba developed what they called the treatment, a combination of tortures that began with public whipping, moved to branding with hot irons, then graduated to progressively more severe mutilations before ending in death. The entire process could take a week. But the psychological warfare was just as brutal as the physical violence. After crushing revolts, colonial authorities would force surviving enslaved people to participate in the executions. They had to carry wood for the fires, dig the graves, even help build the torture devices. The message: if you rebel, your own people will be forced to participate in your punishment. Children weren't spared from witnessing these horrors. In fact, authorities specifically required young people to watch, believing that seeing torture and death would prevent them from rebelling when they grew up. Plantation schools would cancel classes to take students to public executions. The violence didn't stop with the rebels themselves. Families, friends, anyone who might have known about the revolt faced punishment too. In Virginia, after Nat Turner's rebellion, white mobs killed over 200 black people who had nothing to do with the uprising. They called it preventive measures. What's really sick is how proud the authorities were of their cruelty. Letters between colonial officials brag about the creativity of their tortures. They shared techniques, compared methods, and congratulated each other on particularly brutal executions. One letter from a British officer in Barbados describes forcing captured rebels to watch their wives and children be tortured before their own executions began. He writes about it like he's describing a hunting trip, casual, almost cheerful in his recounting of deliberate psychological torment. The Spanish developed mobile torture devices that could be transported from plantation to plantation. When a revolt was discovered, these devices would be brought in and set up in the most visible location possible. The torture would begin immediately, often before investigations were complete, just to make sure everyone knew what the consequences would be. Even death wasn't the end of the punishment. Bodies were left hanging in public places for weeks or months. Heads were displayed in town squares. Limbs were nailed to trees along commonly traveled roads. The decomposing remains of rebels became a permanent reminder of what happened to those who dared resist. The brutality was so extreme that even some colonizers were disturbed by it. But those who complained were told that exceptional circumstances require exceptional measures. The violence wasn't accidental or emotional. It was calculated policy designed to make rebellion psychologically impossible. And it worked. Sort of. Revolts continued to happen, but they became more secretive, more careful, more desperate. People still resisted, but they knew that failure meant torture, and success was almost impossible. That's why these records were destroyed. Not because the violence was rare, but because it was routine. Not because it was minor, but because it was so extreme that future generations might ask uncomfortable questions about the people who ordered it. Number 6, a lesson in silence. The erasure wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It was pedagogy. A carefully designed curriculum with one lesson: resistance is pointless because resistance never happened. This is psychological warfare at its most sophisticated. If you can't convince people that no one has ever successfully fought back, then no one will try to fight back. If you can't make resistance seem impossible, then resistance becomes impossible. The strategy worked like this. After crushing a revolt with maximum brutality, authorities would systematically remove all evidence that the revolt had occurred. No written records, no commemorations, no memorials, no names of the rebels preserved. Within a few years, it would be as if the uprising had never happened at all. But here's the truly diabolical part. Once the records were destroyed, the same authorities would point to the lack of records as proof that slavery wasn't that oppressive. Look, they'd say, if conditions were really so bad, wouldn't we have more evidence of people fighting back? They created the absence of evidence, then used that absence as evidence for their argument. Colonial administrators exchanged letters discussing this strategy explicitly. One British official wrote, "The complete suppression of all accounts of these incidents serves not merely to prevent encouragement of similar actions, but to foster the beneficial impression that such actions are rare and uniformly unsuccessful." The Catholic Church participated enthusiastically in this campaign of silence. Priests were instructed to avoid mentioning slave revolts in sermons, even when discussing the importance of obedience and submission. The logic was that even negative references to rebellion might give people ideas. Educational systems were designed around this silence. Colonial schools taught that enslaved people were naturally submissive, naturally suited for bondage, naturally content with their circumstances. The absence of revolt records was presented as proof of these natural characteristics. Legal systems reinforced the silence. Laws were passed making it illegal to discuss past revolts, even in private conversations. Tavern keepers could lose their licenses for allowing customers to talk about uprising. Servants could be punished for gossiping about rebellion stories they heard from other plantations. The strategy extended to architecture and public space. Sites where revolts had occurred were often demolished and rebuilt, erasing physical reminders of resistance. Public squares where rebels had been executed were redesigned to remove any trace of what had happened there. Even maps participated in the erasure. Locations that had been named after rebel leaders or revolt sites were renamed. Mountains, rivers, and settlements that had carried the memory of resistance were given new names that carried no historical meaning. The economic system reinforced the silence too. Property values depended on the myth of peaceful, compliant labor. Real estate advertisements emphasized the tractable nature of enslaved workers, the absence of troublesome incidents, and the peaceful history of particular plantations. Insurance companies required plantation owners to certify that their properties had no history of disturbances. This created a financial incentive to hide past revolts and an economic punishment for admitting they had occurred. What's most insidious is how the silence became self-perpetuating. As records were destroyed and memories faded, each new generation had less evidence of past resistance. Young people growing up in this environment of artificial peace began to internalize the message that rebellion was not just dangerous, but literally unthinkable. The psychological impact was devastating. When people believe that resistance has never been tried, they don't try to resist. When people believe that no one has ever fought back successfully, they don't fight back. The absence of historical examples becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. Even enslaved people began to doubt their own memories and the stories passed down by their elders. If there was no official record of past revolts, maybe those stories were exaggerated. Maybe the old people were confused. Maybe resistance really was impossible. This doubt was exactly what the authorities wanted to create. They understood that hope is dangerous. They understood that examples of successful resistance inspire more resistance. So they methodically destroyed every example, every story, every trace of successful rebellion. The strategy was so successful that it outlasted slavery itself. Even after emancipation, the silence continued. History books continued to present enslaved people as passive victims rather than active resistors. The absence of revolt records was still being used as evidence that slavery hadn't been that bad. Educational systems continued to teach that resistance had been rare. Textbooks continued to emphasize compliance over rebellion. The lesson of silence echoed through generations, shaping how people understood not just slavery, but the possibility of resistance to any form of oppression. The most tragic part is that the silence became internalized by the descendants of enslaved people themselves. Cut off from the knowledge of their ancestors' courage and resistance, many began to believe the lie that their forebears had been passive victims rather than active fighters. That's the ultimate success of this campaign of erasure. It didn't just hide individual revolts. It hid the entire tradition of resistance, making each new generation feel isolated and alone in their desire for freedom. But the silence was always artificial. The courage was always there. The resistance was always happening. It was just hidden so well that people forgot to look for it. Number 7. The Ghost Leaders. Here's something that'll make your skin crawl. Sometimes, if you dig deep enough into colonial legal records, you'll find names that appear exactly once and then vanish forever. No birth records. No death records. No family history. Just a single mention in a court document or administrative report, and then nothing. These are the ghost leaders. The men and women who organized revolts so successfully that the authorities couldn't completely ignore them, but who were erased so thoroughly that they exist only as shadows in official paperwork. Take a name like Caesar the Carpenter from a 1712 court record in Virginia. He's mentioned as the principal instigator of an uprising that involved over 200 enslaved people. The record states that he was dealt with according to law and that his example should serve as warning to others. And then, nothing. No execution record. No description of his punishment. No follow-up documents. Just a name floating in legal limbo. Was Caesar a real person? Almost certainly. Did he lead a major revolt? The court record suggests he did. What happened to him? That information was deliberately destroyed, leaving only his name as a breadcrumb trail leading nowhere. The pattern repeats across centuries and continents. In Cuba, there's a Spanish colonial report from 1727 mentioning the mulatto woman known as Maria Los Santeros, who allegedly corrupted the minds of numerous slaves with promises of freedom. She's described as extremely dangerous and possessed of unusual influence. The report recommends immediate and permanent resolution of her case. Then silence. No trial record. No execution notice. No transportation order. Maria Los Santeros existed just long enough to be labeled a threat, and then she was ghost-written out of history. Brazil has dozens of these phantom references. João Cabinda shows up in a 1695 letter from a plantation owner to colonial authorities, described as a natural leader among the Africans who was organizing resistance among multiple estates. The letter requests assistance in dealing with this matter with utmost discretion. 3 weeks later, a follow-up letter thanks the authorities for their swift and silent resolution of the João Cabinda problem. No details. No description of what the resolution involved. Just an acknowledgement that whatever they did it quietly. What's haunting is that these names often appear in contexts that suggest they were well-known figures. Court documents refer to the notorious rebel known as, or the infamous leader called, as if everyone knew who they were talking about. But if they were famous, where are all the other references? Where are the detailed descriptions? Where are the stories? They were scrubbed. Systematically and deliberately scrubbed. Sometimes you can find traces of the scrubbing process itself. In Jamaica, there's a colonial administrator's journal from 1745 where several pages have been cut out with a knife. The page before the cuts mentions the rebel captain they call Cudjoe's son and promises to provide full account of his capture and punishment in following pages. Those following pages are gone, cut out so precisely that you can see the knife marks. Someone decided that even the punishment of this rebel leader was too dangerous to record. The Spanish archives contain what might be the most frustrating example. A 1563 report from Peru mentions the mestizo leader whose name cannot be spoken who organized the most serious uprising yet witnessed in this province. The report goes on to say that his name has been ordered struck from all records, and that mention of his deeds is forbidden under penalty of law. So we know there was a leader. We know he was mestizo. We know he organized a major revolt. We know his name was deliberately erased. But we'll never know what that name was because the erasure worked. Sometimes the ghost leaders appear in coded references. French colonial records from Haiti mention the priest of the old religion who was reportedly organizing spiritual and military resistance in the 1680s. Different documents reference this figure over several years, but never by name, never with physical descriptions, never with specific details about his activities. The most chilling ghost leader references come from insurance records. Plantation owners filing damage claims would sometimes mention that losses were caused by the influence of a certain person whose name is known to the authorities. Insurance investigators would note that the usual suspect has been dealt with in a customary manner, but they never wrote down who the usual suspect was or what the customary manner involved. These weren't accidental omissions. Colonial legal systems had specific procedures for handling what they called dangerous names. When certain revolt leaders were captured, court clerks were instructed to use coded designations instead of real names. Defendant, the principal conspirator, the African in question, after trials concluded, Many records were sealed or destroyed specifically to prevent the names of charismatic leaders from inspiring future rebellions. The logic was simple. If people didn't know the names of successful rebel leaders, they couldn't create legends around them. But the ghost references prove that the leaders existed. They prove that the revolts happened. They prove that some enslaved people were so effective at organizing resistance that the authorities considered their very names to be weapons. The erasure was so thorough that even family members lost track of their ancestors. Descendants of these ghost leaders grew up with family stories about great-grandfathers or great-grandmothers who had been important or influential or who had gotten into trouble with the authorities, but the specific details had been lost. What's most tragic is that these ghost leaders were probably the most successful rebels. The ones whose names appear in clear detail in historical records were often the ones who were captured quickly or betrayed early. The ghost leaders were the ones who were dangerous enough, successful enough, and influential enough that their names had to be erased completely. They exist now only as shadows, as gaps in the records, as questions without answers. But their invisibility is its own form of evidence. You don't erase people who don't matter. You don't destroy the names of failures. You destroy the names of heroes. Number 8. Archaeology speaks. Here's the thing about trying to hide history. You can burn the documents. You can kill the witnesses. You can forbid people from talking about what happened. But you can't make the physical evidence disappear. The earth remembers everything. That's where archaeology becomes revolutionary. When the official records lie or stay silent, the ground tells the truth. Take the Zomia plantation site in South Carolina. For over 2 centuries, local history books describe it as a model plantation where enslaved people lived in relative contentment and where no significant disturbances ever occurred. The plantation owners' records, preserved in the state archives, supported this narrative. Peaceful harvests, profitable crops, obedient workers. But when archaeologists excavated the site in the 1990s, they found something very different. Layers of ash indicating multiple large fires that burned simultaneously across different areas of the plantation. Musket balls scattered throughout the slave quarters. Hidden caches of improvised weapons, sharpened tools, clubs made from farming implements, knives forged from scrap metal. Most telling of all, they found a mass grave containing the remains of at least 40 people, all buried at the same time, all showing signs of violent death. Crushed skulls, broken bones, evidence of hanging. This wasn't disease or accident. This was massacre. The physical evidence told a story the documents had tried to erase. There had been a major revolt at Zomia. It had been large enough to require military intervention. It had ended with mass executions. And then everyone had agreed to pretend it never happened. Similar discoveries are happening everywhere archaeologists look. In Jamaica, excavations of former plantation sites consistently reveal burned structures, mass graves, and hidden weapon caches that don't appear in any historical records. The silence in the documents is deafening, but the ground is screaming. One of the most dramatic discoveries happened in Cuba in 2003. Colonial records describe the Santa Rosa estate as a peaceful and profitable sugar plantation that operated without incident from 1750 to 1820. But when archaeologists examined the site, they found evidence of at least 3 separate violent episodes. The first layer contained the remains of the original plantation buildings, destroyed by fire around 1760. The second layer showed rapid reconstruction, followed by another destruction around 1780. The third layer revealed a different architectural approach, heavily fortified buildings, reinforced walls, and what appeared to be defensive positions. Hidden under the floors of the slave quarters, archaeologists found weapons that had been carefully concealed and preserved. Not just improvised weapons, but sophisticated tools of war. Crossbows, gunpowder, metal spearheads, even pieces of armor that had been stolen or scavenged from Spanish soldiers. This wasn't random violence. This was organized warfare. The enslaved people at Santa Rosa had been preparing for battle, stockpiling weapons, and planning coordinated attacks for decades. Yet none of this appears in any Spanish colonial record. In Brazil, excavations at former plantation sites have revealed underground tunnels connecting slave quarters to nearby forests. These weren't escape routes. They were supply lines. Archaeological evidence shows that these tunnels were used to move weapons, food, and messengers between plantation communities and free settlements in the mountains. The tunnel systems are incredibly sophisticated. Some stretch for miles underground, with ventilation shafts, storage chambers, and multiple exit points. Building them would have required years of secret construction involving hundreds of people. Yet Portuguese colonial records from the same areas mention nothing about organized resistance or suspicious activity. One of the most haunting archaeological discoveries came from a plantation site in Virginia. Excavators found a hidden room beneath what appeared to be a normal storage building. Inside the room were the remains of printing equipment, type, ink, and paper, along with fragments of printed materials in multiple languages. The enslaved people at this plantation had been running a secret printing operation, producing materials that promoted resistance and rebellion. Chemical analysis of the ink fragments revealed text in English, Spanish, French, and several African languages. This was international propaganda, designed to coordinate resistance across different colonies and language groups. The printing operation must have required incredible skill and secrecy. Someone had to obtain the equipment without detection. Someone had to operate the press without making noise. Someone had to distribute the materials without getting caught. Yet there's no mention of any of this in plantation records or colonial government documents. Archaeological evidence also reveals the true scale of revolt planning. At multiple sites across the Caribbean, excavators have found evidence of synchronized destruction. Plantation buildings burned on the same nights, coordinated attacks that required precise timing and communication across long distances. One example from Jamaica shows 5 separate plantation sites, located over 50 miles apart, that all burned on the same night in 1734. The coordination required for this kind of simultaneous action would have taken months of planning and a sophisticated communication network. Yet British colonial records treat these as isolated incidents with no connection to each other. The physical evidence reveals military tactics that were far more advanced than historical records suggest. At the site of the 1712 New York Revolt, archaeologists found evidence of sophisticated defensive positions, coordinated fire attacks, and even booby traps designed to slow pursuing militia. The rebels had transformed ordinary buildings into fortresses, creating arrow slits in walls, reinforcing doors with metal bars, and stockpiling supplies for extended sieges. This wasn't spontaneous violence. This was strategic warfare. What's most remarkable is the evidence of cross-cultural cooperation. Archaeological sites show African military techniques being combined with Native American tactics and European weapon technology. Enslaved people weren't just fighting individually. They were learning from each other, adapting strategies, and creating new forms of resistance. At a former plantation site in South Carolina, excavators found weapons that combined African metalworking techniques with Native American designs and European materials. These weren't crude improvised tools. These were sophisticated weapons created by skilled craftspeople working together across cultural lines. The underground networks were vast. Archaeological evidence suggests that resistance communities maintained regular contact across hundreds of miles, sharing intelligence, coordinating attacks, and supporting each other's operations. This required a level of organization that colonial authorities either couldn't detect or chose not to record. Some of the most powerful evidence comes from burial sites. Mass graves that contain the bodies of people who died violently, buried in haste, often without proper ceremonies. These graves tell stories of brutal suppression that official records describe as minor disturbances quickly resolved. But the graves also tell stories of resistance. Bodies buried with weapons. Burial practices that combine multiple cultural traditions. Evidence that communities continued to honor their dead even when doing so was dangerous. The physical evidence doesn't lie. It can't be edited, censored, or destroyed as easily as documents. And what it reveals is a history of constant resistance, sophisticated organization, and coordinated rebellion that was systematically erased from official records. Every archaeological site tells the same story. The silence in the historical record isn't because resistance was rare. It's because resistance was so common and so effective that authorities couldn't allow future generations to know about it. Number 9. The hidden truth in songs. You want to know something that'll blow your mind? Some of the most beautiful, innocent-sounding folk songs you've ever heard are actually detailed military manuals disguised as entertainment. Take Follow the Drinking Gourd, a song that sounds like a simple spiritual about looking to heaven for guidance. But Drinking Gourd was code for the Big Dipper constellation, and the song contains precise navigation instructions for escaped slaves heading north. Every verse describes real geographic landmarks, seasonal timing, and safe house locations along the Underground Railroad. The riverbank makes a very good road. The dead trees will show you the way isn't poetry. It's a GPS system for people who couldn't read maps. But that's just the beginning. Dig deeper into folk traditions, and you'll find that enslaved communities preserve detailed accounts of successful revolts in songs that sound completely harmless to outside listeners. In the Sea Islands off the coast of Georgia, there's a song called, "Oh Mary, Don't You Weep." On the surface, it's a religious song about biblical stories. But listen to the coded lyrics. Pharaoh's army got drowned dead refers to specific slave patrols that were defeated. Moses was code for revolt leaders. Crossing over Jordan meant successful escapes to free territory. The song contains names, dates, and locations of real historical events, all disguised as biblical references. Generations of children learned these songs without realizing they were memorizing resistance history. Caribbean work songs are even more sophisticated. In Trinidad, there's a traditional calypso called Jean and Dinah that sounds like it's about two women arguing over a man. But the man they're fighting over is actually territory, and the song describes the tactics used in the 1725 uprising led by a rebel named Sambo. The rhythm of the song matches the rhythm of work, so enslaved people could sing it while performing plantation labor without attracting suspicion. But every verse preserves specific details about battle formations, weapon caches, and escape routes. In Jamaica, the song Hill and Gully Rider sounds like it's about a cowboy, but hill and gully refer to the mountainous terrain where maroon communities established independent settlements. The rider was a messenger who carried information between rebel camps. The song preserves an entire communication network disguised as entertainment. What's amazing is how these songs traveled. The same melodies appear in different countries with different lyrics, but the underlying information structure remains the same. Enslaved people from different plantations, different islands, even different countries were sharing intelligence through music. Brazilian samba has the same hidden layer. Songs that sound like they're about dancing and partying often contain detailed information about Quilombo locations, the independent communities established by escaped slaves. The dance steps themselves sometimes encoded directions to these settlements. In one traditional samba, the lyrics describe a party in the mountains where everyone is welcome and the music never stops. But the mountains were specific locations where Quilombos provided sanctuary, and the music never stops meant these communities were permanently established and defended. Religious music was particularly effective for hiding resistance information. Spirituals like Swing Low, Sweet Chariot sound like songs about death and heaven, but they're actually about underground railroads and escape networks. Chariot was code for the transportation systems that moved escaped slaves to safety. I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Coming for to carry me home. A band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. That's not about dying and going to heaven. That's about underground railroad conductors coming to guide people to freedom. Even children's songs preserve forbidden knowledge. Ring games and hand-clapping songs that seem completely innocent often contain coded information about revolt leaders, successful escapes, and safe locations. There's a children's song from Louisiana that goes, "Sally Walker sitting in a saucer, rise Sally Walker, wipe your weeping eyes." Sounds like a simple game, right? But Sally Walker was code for a famous female rebel leader, and sitting in a saucer referred to her hiding place in a depression between hills. The song preserved her story and location for future generations. What's most remarkable is how accurate these musical records are. When historians can cross-reference the coded information in songs with archaeological evidence or surviving documents, the details almost always match perfectly. People who couldn't read or write still managed to preserve complex historical information with incredible precision. The call-and-response structure of many African American musical traditions wasn't just cultural, it was educational. One person would sing a line containing historical information, and the group would respond with the next line. This ensured that everyone learned the complete story and could pass it on accurately. Field hollers, the work songs sung by individuals laboring alone, often contained current intelligence about ongoing resistance activities. A person working in one field could communicate with someone working in another field through songs that sounded like simple expressions of emotion but actually conveyed specific information about planned escapes or revolt activities. Even funeral songs served as historical preservation systems. When rebel leaders died, their stories became part of the burial ceremony. Mourners would sing about their achievements, their tactics, and their legacy, ensuring that their memories survived even when their names were erased from official records. Colonial authorities knew that music was being used to preserve and transmit forbidden information. They passed laws restricting certain types of singing, banned instruments like drums that could be used for long-distance communication, and tried to separate enslaved people who spoke the same languages. But they couldn't stop the music. Songs adapted, evolved, and survived. The melodies that sound most innocent often carried the most dangerous information. Today, if you know how to listen, you can still hear the resistance. Blues songs that talk about troubles often refer to specific historical revolts. Spirituals that mention crossing over preserved navigation information. Folk songs that seem to be about love often describe the love of freedom and the people who died fighting for it. The official history books stay silent, but the people never stop singing. And in their songs, they preserve the truth that the authorities tried so hard to destroy. Number 10. Why erasure was the point. Here's the thing that should terrify you about this whole story. The erasure of slave revolts wasn't a side effect of oppression. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't something that just happened over time as records got lost or damaged. The erasure was the point. It was the most important part of the entire system of control. Because here's what the people in power understood that we're only beginning to recognize. Controlling the present isn't enough if you want to maintain control over the future. You have to control the past too. You have to control what people remember, what they learn from, what inspires them. Think about it this way. If you're running a system that depends on people accepting their oppression, the most dangerous thing in the world is proof that oppression can be resisted successfully. Examples of successful resistance are like viruses. They spread, they mutate, they inspire new outbreaks in places you can't predict or control. So you don't just crush the resistance. You erase it. You make it disappear so completely that future generations don't even know it was possible. The slave owners, colonial administrators, and government officials who orchestrated this erasure were playing a much longer game than we usually realize. They weren't just trying to prevent the next revolt. They were trying to prevent revolts from happening 50 years later, 100 years later, forever. And it worked. Think about how successful this strategy has been. Most people today, even educated people, even people who consider themselves well-informed about history, have no idea how common slave revolts actually were. The erasure was so complete that we still live with its effects centuries later. But here's the really insidious part. The erasure created a feedback loop that justified itself. Once the records of resistance were destroyed, the absence of those records was used as evidence that resistance had been rare. Look, later generations would say, if enslaved people had really been fighting back constantly, wouldn't we have more evidence of it? This is gaslighting on a historical scale. Create the absence of evidence, then use that absence as evidence for your argument. The strategy was so successful that it shaped how we think about resistance to oppression in general. If people today believe that enslaved people rarely fought back, they're more likely to believe that oppressed people throughout history rarely fought back. The erasure of slave revolts contributes to a broader narrative that presents oppressed people as passive victims rather than active resistors. This has profound political implications that extend far beyond historical accuracy. If you can't convince people that resistance is historically rare, you can convince them that resistance is naturally rare. If you can't make people believe that their ancestors accepted oppression passively, you can make them more likely to accept oppression passively themselves. The people who orchestrated this erasure understood something that we're still struggling to grasp. History isn't just about the past. History shapes the future. The stories we tell about what happened determine what people think is possible. That's why authoritarian governments throughout history have always tried to control historical narratives. It's why book burning is such a common tactic of oppressive regimes. It's why controlling education is always a priority for people who want to maintain unjust power structures. The erasure of slave revolts was one of the most successful propaganda campaigns in human history. It convinced multiple generations that resistance was rare, unsuccessful, and ultimately pointless. It made people believe that the system of slavery was so total, so overwhelming, that opposition was almost unthinkable. But the propaganda only worked because people didn't know it was propaganda. The absence of revolt records seemed natural, accidental, unremarkable. People didn't question why the records were missing, because they didn't know the records had ever existed. That's the genius of erasure as a control mechanism. It doesn't look like control. It looks like absence. It looks like nothing happened, so there's nothing to investigate, nothing to question, nothing to resist. The effects of this erasure extend far beyond slavery itself. The myth that enslaved people rarely resisted has been used to justify all kinds of historical narratives about race, power, and resistance. It's been used to argue that certain populations are naturally submissive, naturally suited for subordination, naturally incapable of self-governance. These arguments didn't disappear with emancipation. They were recycled during Jim Crow, during colonialism in Africa and Asia, during every subsequent period when powerful groups needed to justify oppressing less powerful ones. The silence about slave revolts provided a template for silencing other forms of resistance. But here's what the people who orchestrated the erasure didn't anticipate. Eventually, the physical evidence would start speaking. Archaeological discoveries, careful analysis of surviving documents, and preservation of oral traditions would begin to reveal the truth they had tried so hard to hide. What we're discovering is that resistance wasn't rare, it was constant. It wasn't unsuccessful. Many revolts achieved significant objectives, even when they didn't completely overthrow the system. It wasn't unthinkable, it was so common that authorities had to develop systematic procedures for covering it up. The real history of slave revolts reveals something that the people in power desperately didn't want us to know. Oppression always creates resistance. Always. Even under the most brutal conditions, even when the odds are impossible, even when the consequences are death, people fight back. That knowledge is dangerous. It's dangerous because it reveals that no system of oppression is permanent, no matter how total it seems. It's dangerous because it shows that resistance is not only possible, but inevitable. It's dangerous because it reminds us that ordinary people, facing impossible odds, can still choose to fight for freedom. That's why the erasure had to be so complete. That's why the cover-up had to be so systematic. The people in power understood that the memory of successful resistance is itself a form of resistance. They tried to steal that memory from us. They tried to convince us that our ancestors were passive victims, that resistance is historically rare, that fighting back is pointless. They almost succeeded. But they didn't count on the earth remembering what the books forgot. They didn't count on the songs preserving what the documents destroyed. They didn't count on the whispers surviving the silence. And they definitely didn't count on us finding the evidence they tried so hard to hide and learning the truth they were desperate to conceal. The slave revolts they tried to erase are finally being remembered. The heroes they tried to forget are finally being honored. The resistance they tried to silence is finally being heard. Because the truth is, you can burn the records, but you can't burn the courage. You can kill the rebels, but you can't kill the spirit of rebellion. You can erase the history, but you can't erase the fact that it happened. And once we know it happened, once we understand how common it was, once we recognize how hard they worked to hide it from us, we can never unsee the truth. The silence is broken. The secrets are out. The resistance is remembered. And that changes everything. So here we are, at the end of this journey through the shadows of history. You've seen the evidence. You've heard the whispers. You felt the weight of all those erased stories pressing against the silence that tried to contain them. But this isn't really the end, is it? This is the beginning. Because now you know something that powerful people spent centuries trying to hide from you. Now you carry the memory of resistance that they tried to steal from all of us. Think about where we started tonight. We began with empty history books, with the assumption that slave revolts were rare, with the belief that oppressed people throughout history mostly accepted their fate without fighting back. We started with silence. But silence, it turns out, is never natural. Silence is always manufactured. When you don't hear something, it's not because it didn't happen. It's because someone decided you shouldn't hear it. Tonight, you've learned that resistance wasn't the exception, it was the rule. Every plantation, every colony, every system of oppression bred its own opposition. People didn't accept bondage. They fought it. Constantly. Creatively. Courageously. Even when fighting meant certain death. You've learned that the absence of records doesn't mean the absence of resistance. It means someone worked very hard to create that absence. Someone burned documents, destroyed archives, silenced witnesses, and erased names because they understood that memory is power. You've learned that even when the official records disappeared, the truth survived in songs, stories, whispers, and bones buried in unmarked graves. The earth remembers what the books forgot. The people remembered what the authorities tried to erase. But most importantly, you've learned that this erasure wasn't ancient history. It wasn't something that happened long ago and then stopped. The effects of this systematic cover-up are still with us today. They shape how we think about resistance, about possibility, about what ordinary people can accomplish when they decide to fight for freedom. Every time someone tells you that protesting doesn't work, remember the slave revolts they try to hide. Every time someone argues that resistance is pointless, remember the leaders whose names were deliberately erased because their examples were too dangerous to preserve. Every time someone claims that oppressed people throughout history were passive victims, remember the songs that encoded military tactics and the underground networks that spanned continents. The people who orchestrated this erasure understood something crucial. The past shapes the future. The stories we tell about what happened determine what people think is possible. If you can't convince people that resistance has always been rare and unsuccessful, you can convince them not to resist. But the opposite is also true. When people learn that resistance has always been common, when they discover that ordinary people have always found ways to fight back against impossible odds, when they understand that no system of oppression has ever been permanent, that knowledge changes everything. That's why recovering these lost stories matters. That's why breaking the silence matters. That's why remembering the erased matters. Because memory is not just about honoring the past. Memory is about empowering the future. The slave revolts they try to hide from you weren't just historical events. They were proof of concept. Proof that resistance is possible. Proof that courage is contagious. Proof that ordinary people can challenge extraordinary power when they work together. And that proof is dangerous. It's dangerous to anyone who benefits from systems of inequality and oppression. It's dangerous to anyone who needs people to believe that fighting back is pointless. It's dangerous to anyone whose power depends on other people's acceptance of powerlessness. That's why they tried so hard to hide these stories from you. That's why they invested so much effort in creating and maintaining the silence. They knew that if you learn the truth about resistance, you might start getting ideas about resistance. Well, now you know the truth. Now you have the ideas. Now you carry the memory they tried to steal. So what are you going to do with it? You could forget what you've learned tonight. You could file it away as interesting historical trivia and go back to accepting the version of history you were taught in school. You could let the silence reassert itself. Or you could remember. You could share these stories. You could pass on the knowledge that resistance is not only possible, but inevitable. You could add your voice to the chorus that refuses to let these heroes be forgotten. You could look around at the world today, at the systems of inequality, the structures of oppression, the voices trying to convince people that fighting back is pointless, and you could remember that people have always fought back. People have always found ways to resist. People have always chosen courage over compliance, even when the cost was everything they had. The slave revolts they tried to erase are finally being remembered. The silence is finally being broken. The truth is finally being told. But remembering isn't enough. Memory without action is just nostalgia. The real question isn't whether you'll remember these stories. The real question is whether you'll learn from them. Because the same forces that tried to erase slave revolts are still at work today. The same strategies of silence, denial, and historical manipulation are still being used to convince people that resistance is rare, unsuccessful, and pointless. The same powerful interests that benefited from slavery are still trying to control what you know about the past so they can control what you think is possible in the future. But now you know better. Now you know that resistance is as old as oppression. Now you know that courage is as common as cruelty. Now you know that the stories they don't want you to hear are exactly the stories you need to remember. The enslaved people who rose up in revolt weren't superhuman. They weren't special. They were ordinary people who decided that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. They were people like you, facing systems that seemed too big to challenge, making the choice to resist anyway. Their revolts were erased from history, but their courage doesn't have to be erased from memory. Their names were deleted from the records, but their examples don't have to be deleted from inspiration. Their stories were hidden in silence, but that silence doesn't have to continue. You have the power to break the silence. You have the power to remember what they tried to make you forget. You have the power to carry forward the legacy of resistance that they tried to bury. The question is, will you? Tonight, you've learned that history is not a collection of facts carved in stone. History is a conversation between the past and the present. And that conversation has been dominated for too long by the voices of the powerful, the oppressors, the people who benefited from systems of exploitation. But their voices were never the only voices. They were just the loudest voices, amplified by power and preserved by privilege. The other voices, the voices of resistance, of rebellion, of refusal to accept injustice, were always there. They were just silenced, hidden, erased. Now those voices are being recovered. Now those stories are being told. Now that memory is being reclaimed. And you are part of that reclamation. By listening to these stories, by learning these truths, by refusing to accept the silence that was imposed on them, you become part of the resistance to historical erasure. You become part of the fight to ensure that courage is remembered, that resistance is honored, that the heroes who died fighting for freedom are not forgotten. The slave revolts happened. The resistance was real. The courage was constant. They tried to hide it from you, but they failed. Now you know. Now you remember. Now you carry the torch they tried to extinguish. What you do with that flame is up to you. But remember this, every time you share these stories, every time you refuse to accept the silence, every time you choose to remember what they tried to make you forget, you are continuing the resistance. You are proving that erasure is not permanent. You are proving that silence can be broken. You are proving that the truth, no matter how hard they try to bury it, will eventually find its way to the light. The disappearing slave revolts are disappearing no more. Welcome to the resistance of memory. Welcome to the rebellion of truth. Welcome to the revolution of remembering. The enslaved people who rose up in revolt weren't superhuman. They weren't special. They were ordinary people who decided that freedom was worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossible. They were people like you, facing systems that seemed too big to challenge, making the choice to resist anyway. Their revolts were erased from history, but their courage doesn't have to be erased from memory. Their names were deleted from the records, but their examples don't have to be deleted from inspiration. Their stories were hidden in silence, but that silence doesn't have to continue. You have the power to break the silence. You have the power to remember what they tried to make you forget. You have the power to carry forward the legacy of resistance that they tried to bury. The question is, will you? Tonight, you've learned that history is not a collection of facts carved in stone. History is a conversation between the past and the present. And that conversation has been dominated for too long by the voices of the powerful, the oppressors, the people who benefited from systems of exploitation. But their voices were never the only voices. They were just the loudest voices, amplified by power and preserved by privilege. The other voices, the voices of resistance, of rebellion, of refusal to accept injustice, were always there. They were just silenced, hidden, erased. Now those voices are being recovered. Now those stories are being told. Now that memory is being reclaimed. And you are part of that reclamation. By listening to these stories, by learning these truths, by refusing to accept the silence that was imposed on them, you become part of the resistance to historical erasure. You become part of the fight to ensure that courage is remembered, that resistance is honored, that the heroes who died fighting for freedom are not forgotten. The slave revolts happened. The resistance was real. The courage was constant. They tried to hide it from you, but they failed. Now you know. Now you remember. Now you carry the torch they tried to extinguish. What you do with that flame is up to you. But remember this, every time you share these stories, every time you refuse to accept the silence, every time you choose to remember what they tried to make you forget, you are continuing the resistance. You are proving that erasure is not permanent. You are proving that silence can be broken. You are proving that the truth, no matter how hard they try to bury it, will eventually find its way to the light. The disappearing slave revolts are disappearing no more. Welcome to the resistance of memory. Welcome to the rebellion of truth. Welcome to the revolution of remembering.